Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. In the quiet morning air of a modest household near ancient Thebes, the sand stirred gently at the doorway of a sun-hardened home made of mud brick. Inside, a little girl no older than 3 swayed back and forth on a woven reed mat, tracing her fingers across a worn wooden toy shaped like a lotus blossom. She did not yet know that her future had already been sealed, agreed upon, negotiated, and traded in the form of linen bolts and barley baskets. Her name was Senum, and though no one would remember her centuries later, her life would be shaped by decisions made before her teeth even came in. In ancient Egypt, a girl was rarely just a girl. She was also a future wife, a woman waiting, a channel through which property, status, and family honor would flow. Marriage was not merely a social bond. It was a legal transaction carefully constructed through papyrus contracts, temple witnesses, and domestic expectations so old that even the scribes could not trace their origin. The dowry was not just a tradition. It was a financial insurance policy paid by the bride's family to ensure the husband's goodwill. A girl's value was cataloged before she could read or write. Her skin, her health, her family's trade. These were the unspoken metrics that shaped her destiny. Senum's father was a stonemason, respected but not rich. He worked on smaller tomb commissions along the edge of the Valley of the Kings, shaping limestone into smooth funerary stele that whispered the names of those long buried. Her mother kept chickens, bartered fish, and knew the names of midwives by heart. This modest but stable household had one valuable asset, a healthy daughter of marriageable stock. So before Senum's 4th summer, she was betrothed to a boy 6 years her senior, the son of a grain overseer with connections to the temple granaries in Karnak. There was no celebration, no garland of flowers or painted oil lamps, just a solemn visit from the groom's father, a clay tablet bearing the agreed-upon exchange, and a sealed promise that when she bled for the first time, she would be prepared for womanhood and sent to live with her husband's family. Until then, she remained a daughter, but a daughter with an expiration date. The concept of childhood was not the same in ancient Egypt as it is today. Children were expected to contribute early, girls even more so. By age 5 or 6, Senum would fetch water in glazed pottery jars nearly her own height. She would gather rushes for bedding, pound grain for flour, and sweep dust from threshold stones worn smooth by generations. By 8, she would learn to patch linen garments with a bone needle and to mix honey with crushed carob for healing scrapes. Her world was defined by repetition, rhythm, and the silent awareness that she was preparing for a life that was already mapped out. Girls were not formally educated like boys. There was no scribal training unless one was of priestly descent or particularly favored, but the education of women was nonetheless meticulous. It was an oral inheritance, passed from mother to daughter, aunt to niece, midwife to apprentice, the signs of labor, the symptoms of spoiled grain, the order in which to knead, bake, ferment, all stored in memory, like living scrolls. Knowledge was power, but only if it helped the household, okay? And that was all anyone expected from Senum. Marriage, in ancient Egypt, was more flexible than in other ancient cultures. Cool, but this flexibility didn't necessarily benefit young girls. There were no religious ceremonies or wedding feasts, required only a contract and a move-in date. Girls as young as 12 could be wed, and though the average age for marriage hovered slightly older, social and economic pressures often dictated. Otherwise, a girl from a poorer family like Senum was more likely to be married young, sometimes as soon as her body showed signs of fertility. Puberty, then, was not a biological event. It was a starting gun monarchy. The first menstrual cycle was treated not with celebration, but with a subdued sense of readiness. There were amulets involved, tiny clay figures of Base, the dwarf god of childbirth and protection, hung from walls and worn on thin leather cords. Women murmured spells from the Book of the Dead, not for the deceased, but to ensure the safety of a living girl about to enter a world of risk. Pregnancy in ancient Egypt was not considered miraculous. It was expected, and it was dangerous. By the time Senum reached her 11th year, her life had begun to narrow. She stopped playing near the river. Her walks were chaperoned. Akira's were heavier. She visited her betrothed's household for weekly familiarity, learning the layout of a house that would soon become her own. The boy, not much older than 13, ignored her mostly. He practiced measuring barley for tithes and shadowed his father through dusty storerooms, stacked with amphorae. When their eyes met, it was often with mutual discomfort. Neither of them had chosen this, and yet this was the norm. In a society where lineage and labor were bound by survival, affection was optional. Compatibility was hoped for, but never guaranteed. What mattered most was fertility, obedience, and the management of food and linen stocks. These were the traits praised in funerary inscriptions. She kept a clean house. She bore sons. She pleased her husband's household. The gods might judge the soul, but neighbors judged the household, and neighbors talked. One of the crueler realities for girls like Senum was the unspoken knowledge that death was near. Not for them, necessarily, though childbirth often proved fatal, but all around them, infant mortality was high. Maternal mortality was common. Women were buried with perfumed cones on their heads and amulets on their bellies, symbols of a life that had served its purpose, even if it ended early. Girls like Senum saw these funerals up close, helped prepare burial oils, folded linens, whispered protective words as they pressed scarabs into still hands. They knew what was coming, and yet they followed the path anyway. But here lies the question. In a world where your life was promised before you could understand the word promise, what parts of yourself, whatever truly yours, was Senum's smile her own, her chores, her thoughts when she lay awake on her mat and listened to her mother breathe? Would she ever get to choose? The sun over Thebes had grown cruel by the time Senum entered her 12th year. It did not blaze like it once had when she was a child. Instead, it seemed to sit still above the Nile, glaring down as if daring the earth to resist its heat. Tea was in that dry season when the reeds stiffened and the sky forgot how to rain. That Senum was taken from her mother's home and delivered to her new family. She did not weep, not because she was brave, but because it hadn't occurred to her that she had a right to cry. No formal ceremony marked the occasion. Her father had long since agreed to the terms. The dowry had been paid over the last few seasons in small, manageable gifts: goose feathers, 3 amphorae of date beer, a large woven basket of lentils. In exchange, Senum would become the wife of Hori, a boy of barely 15, whose father worked as a scribe in the temple granaries. They weren't wealthy, but they were secure. They had influence. That was enough. Senum wore linen that day not white, but a slightly yellowed offcut her mother had embroidered with blue thread. The threads formed fish and stylized lotus buds, each looped carefully in silence by a woman who knew she would never again dress her child for anything that mattered. Senum's hair was oiled and combed flat. A faint scent of frankincense clung to her, not strong enough to mask the sweat she carried with her from the walk. And then she was gone. The door of her childhood home shut behind her without ritual. A new threshold opened, and in that moment, she stopped being a daughter and became a wife. But to be a wife in ancient Egypt was not to be loved, or to even noticed at first. It was to be useful. Hori's household was ruled not by him, but by his mother, an aging woman with stiff knees and sharp judgment, who had no patience for a girl too young to manage the storeroom or grind flour without supervision. Sinem was not considered a full adult, not yet, but she had passed into a state of in-betweenness, too old to be a child, too young to command authority. That made her invisible, in a way, a body in the room, always working, never speaking unless spoken to. Her days followed a strict rhythm: wake before sunrise, sweep the hearth, fetch water, knead dough, rinse jars, rinse her hands, knead again. The hum of her routine was punctuated only by the occasional command, turn that, not like that, more salt, and the endless grinding of barley on stone. The corn left her hands raw, her shoulders tight, her hair became coarse with flour. She slept alone on a mat near the doorway, beneath the clay figurine of Taurid, the pregnant hippopotamus, goddess of fertility and childbirth. It glared down at her each night, swollen and toothy, offering protection she didn't yet need, and hoped never to. There was no affection between Sinem and Hori. He was quiet, careful, and visibly uncomfortable when they crossed paths in the storeroom or shared a meal at the reed mat. Their marriage was not consummated, not yet. Egyptian law permitted consummation at puberty, but many families delayed it until the girl appeared ready. Still, the expectation loomed. It was a matter of when, not if. Sinem's own body had begun to betray her. Her hips widened, her chest ached beneath her linen shift. The telltale signs of menses had not yet appeared, but her time was nearing. She sensed it in the way her mother-in-law watched her hips when she walked, and how the midwife's name was suddenly whispered in conversations about the future. It was coming, and when it came, it arrived quietly. No one announced it. No one sang or danced. Sinem noticed the blood in the morning while sweeping the ash from last night's fire. It was not much, just enough to stain her shift and leave her still for several minutes, staring at the mark. She folded the linen under herself and sat in the ashes, thinking, not praying, not weeping, just thinking. When she told her mother-in-law, the woman nodded once, left the room, and returned with a dried fig and a strip of linen. "You'll bleed every moon," she said flatly, "until you carry." She handed over a bundle of rags and left again. That night, Taurid stared down at her again. In ancient Egypt, menstruation was not hidden or vilified like it would be in later civilizations. It was inconvenient, certainly, messy, but not shameful. Women created clever folded pads from softened papyrus or linen, and temples occasionally recorded recipes for potions to regulate the cycle or ease cramps. Still, there was no sanctuary during menstruation, no retreat. A girl bled and worked and bled again. If anything, menstruation was celebrated, not for what it was, but for what it meant. She could now produce an heir. The following week, Sinem was moved to the main sleeping space. Hori joined her, still mostly silent, his hands always unsure. Their first few nights were cold with nervousness. There was no great violation, no tenderness either, just the awkward, confused fumbling of two children playing at adulthood, guided only by instruction and vague tradition. Soon after, whispers began. She will carry before harvest, the old women predicted. The young are always fertile after the flood. Midwives began checking on her. Her food was supplemented with figs, honey, and beer mixed with date sirupal, believed to promote fertility. She was told not to lift heavy pots, not to bend near the oven's smoke, not to cross the threshold during a thunderstorm. Even her dreams, if they featured crocodiles or serpents, were noted down as omens. Sinem's belly remained flat. One moon passed. Then, too, her cycle arrived and departed on time, like the rising Nile. The older women began watching her face for signs of fullness, listening for nausea. She felt nothing. She was tired, but she had always been tired. 3 months passed. No pregnancy. Can't. With each passing month, the silence around her grew heavier. Her value, once tied to her dowry, was now tied to her ability to produce. Without children, she remained liminal, not yet a true wife, not yet a true woman. And though Egyptian law permitted divorce and women could initiate it, she knew she would not be the one to leave. She would be sent back, so she prayed. But prayer in ancient Egypt was not personal. It was ritual, offerings, statues. She visited the neighborhood shrine to Hathor and left a token of blue bead in the shape of a cow's eye, tied with a reed. She whispered her name 3 times into the breeze. She sat in silence, waiting for nothing in particular. A bird passed overhead, and still nothing came. Her mother sent a message by baskets of honey cakes, a dried fig, and a sprig of papyrus, with a short note scratched on it. Your sister has started her courses. Senum stared at the message until the words vanished in her mind. It was not cruelty, but reminder. She was not the only girl. If she failed, someone else would be promised. Someone else would carry. Someone else would matter. By the end of that year, Senum's eyes had lost their softness. Her hands were cracked. Her voice came out like smoke. She no longer looked at her husband when he entered the room. She folded linens with the precision of someone who no longer thought about it. She still wasn't pregnant, but was it her body that failed, or something deeper? Could longing turn to dust? Could a girl become a vessel so thoroughly that even her gods forgot she had a name? And how many others had disappeared the same way? The harvest came and went without incident. The grain silos filled, the oxen plodded back to their shelters, and the Nile receded just as it always had, leaving behind rich, black soil. But inside the small house where Senum lived, nothing had changed. No swelling belly, no whispered congratulations, no carved amulet from the local priest, only silence. The kind of silence that grew so thick it muffled hope before it could breathe. In ancient Egypt, fertility was not just a family concern, it was a social and spiritual one. It was expected, baked into every part of life like sun into mud brick. Even the architecture reflected it. Women painted images of Hathor and Tauret on the walls of their bedrooms or etched them into cosmetic jars. The womb was a vessel, not just of life, but of cosmic order, linked to the rebirth of the sun each morning in the cycles of the river. When a womb refused to bear fruit, it was more than a misfortune. It was a crack in the order of things. Senum knew this. She felt it in the way her mother-in-law measured her glances, in the way Hori's words became fewer, in the quietness that spread through their sleeping mat like mildew. To fix it, they called in the midwife, not for delivery, but for diagnosis. The woman arrived with a basket of tools, wooden probes, bundles of herbs, tiny glazed figurines, and a folded length of linen stained with oils. She sat on a low stool, her back arched like a bow, and asked Senum questions in a clipped, impersonal tone. Was there cramping? Was there irregular bleeding? Did the blood come too early or not at all? Did she feel warmth in her chest, fullness in her breasts, aching in her thighs? Senum answered each question in a voice so small it barely left her throat. Then came the test in the old scrolls. There were dozens of ways to test for pregnancy, most of them based on observation, ritual, or symbolic interpretation. One common method involved barley and emmer wheat. A woman would urinate on 2 bags of seed. If either sprouted within a few days, it was said she was pregnant. Not, she wasn't. And if the barley sprouted faster, it meant a boy. If the emmer, a girl. Senum urinated on both. 3 days passed. Neither sprouted. The midwife shrugged. Perhaps next season, she said, brushing off her knees and folding her cloth. She left without asking further questions. There were other remedies, of course. Poultices made of crocodile dung, now dried and powdered. Spells written in ink made from ochre and fig sap, spoken at dawn. Ritual fumigations, using incense mixed with myrrh, performed as a woman lay with her knees pulled to her chest, stem, submitted to all of them, not because she believed, but because not doing them would make the silence worse and still. Nothing, her mother-in-law began suggesting prayers at the main temple. Perhaps the gods are not watching us here, she said. The shrine to Isis in the city has a strong record. You should go. And so she did. It was a long walk under the brutal sun. The streets of Thebes hummed with midday motion traders calling out weights of cumin and salt. Boys chasing carts, donkeys braying under sacks of grain. Sanum wove through it silently. Just another pair of dusty feet in a world full of hungry mouths and quiet wounds. At the temple, she brought offerings. Not gold. She had none but a length of linen and a small jar of date honey. She poured oil over a statue of Isis and whispered her name. Help me, was all she said. Let me be enough. The priestess, there a woman with lined skin and faded tattoos, touched her wrist briefly and said, sometimes the gods wait longer than we do. But how long was a life supposed to wait? Back at home, the whispering began. Hori's cousins suggested perhaps he should take a second wife's just in case, that it would be temporary, that it would only be until the line was secure. Polygamy was rare, but not forbidden. The man with means could take another wife, especially if the first failed to bear children. Senum heard this secondhand. No one said it to her face, but she heard it nonetheless in the paused conversations when she entered the room. In the sudden hush, when the bread cracked too loud between their teeth. One night, she dreamed of a crocodile walking on two legs. It stood at the edge of the field where barley should have grown and opened its mouth. Inside were not teeth, but seeds. Tia, it spat them at her feet, and they withered before they touched the earth. She told no one of the dream. Instead, she worked harder. She kneaded bread until her knuckles split. She scrubbed the household jars so clean that even the smell of old grain disappeared. She oiled Hori's hair when he sat still long enough. She stitched small protective charms into the hem of his tunic, little ones shaped like frogs and lotus petals, symbols of new life and hope, and still nothing. Time, like the Nile, cyclical in Egypt. There are no abrupt ends, only returns. Senum marked its passage not by calendars, but by absences. How long it had been since she bled. How many women in the neighborhood had given birth. How many new infants had been suckled in the shade while she carried jars of water alone. One day, a young girl barely older than Senum had been when she was wet arrived at their door with a jug of beer and a shy smile. Her name was Beckett. She was not a second wife, Kay. She was, officially, a servant. But everyone knew what that meant. Her father had sent her as an offer. Let her help around the house. She is strong, she learns quickly. Senum said nothing. She let the girl take her place, grinding barley, fetching water, combing her mother-in-law's hair. She let her dot, because what else could she do? There were no words in her language for a wife who was replaced, but not divorced. There were no rules for a girl who had done everything right and still been made invisible. Her belly was flat. Her value was flat. Her life was a linen sheet smoothed down to the floor and stepped over each morning. But she did not leave. She could have. Egyptian law, unique among ancient societies, allowed women to initiate divorce. Okay, they could reclaim their dowry. They could return to their birth families. Okay, they could even remarry. But for Senum, none of that was freedom. Her mother had no room for her. Her dowry was spent, and no man would take a girl who had already failed at the one thing she was supposed to do. So she stayed. She worked. She watched Beckett swell with child by the following spring. She watched her wince through labor on the floor of the same room they all shared. She watched the baby emerge a boy, of course, and heard the room erupt with laughter, joy, prayers. Sanam did not cry. She did not scream. She simply walked to the river the next day and washed a bundle of linen in silence. No one asked her how she was. No one remembered her name during the blessing rites. Her value had faded, but she remained. In ancient Egypt, women lived in a paradox. They could own property, initiate divorce, inherit wealth. And yet, their social worth, especially in marriage, was still chained to the womb. A quiet woman, infertile but obedient, might be tolerated. A loud one, infertile and proud, would be cast out. Sanam chose the silence, not because it was safe, but because it was all she had left. Years passed. She became an expert in poultices, mending, measuring grain. She raised back its son as if he were her own. The boy never called her mother, but he sat near her when he cried. That was enough. And when she was old, older than most women lived to be, she died quietly in the night, beneath the same statue of Tauret she had stared at for so many years. Her name was written on a small piece of broken pottery, and no great stele, no carved offering table, but her name survived, scratched into clay, held in the Museum of Time. Because sometimes the most disturbing part of history is not how people suffered, but how completely they were expected to endure. If you stood outside the home of a high-ranking Egyptian noble during the New Kingdom, around the 18th dynasty, and listened carefully not to the streets filled with donkey carts or to the prayer calls rising from the temples, but to the heavy silence behind the walls, you might have heard nothing at all. That was by design. The homes of the wealthy were built like small fortresses, painted white to reflect the sun, edged with high mud brick walls to keep the dust out, and shaded by sycamore fig trees. These homes gave the illusion of cool calmness. But inside, behind thick doors and carefully curated courtyards, the daughters of noblemen were kept out of sight, their voices rarely heard outside their chambers, their thoughts barely recorded. What existed beyond the plastered walls was not their world. Their domain, limited, decorative, tightly managed, was shaped for others. And within such a household, in the city of Wyset thieves, lived a young girl named Tehemet. She was born under fortunate omens, or so the scribe said. The day of her birth coincided with a rare alignment of stars noted by her father's priestly astrologer. Her father, a wealthy temple administrator, took this as a sign. He ordered that her birth room be blessed with incense, that a scribe write down her horoscope, and that a gold amulet in the shape of a sacred scarab be tied around her neck. She was, from her first breath, considered valuable, but not in the way her brothers were. Her value was not measured in education or title. It was not expected that she would one day run estates, train as a scribe, or even engage with the temple bureaucracy that funded their household. Tehemet's path had been charted differently. She was a dowry, a seal, a promise to be kept until it could be traded, and so, from the moment she could walk, she was trained in stillness. She was not taught to write in hieroglyphs, though she memorized the sound of them. Her brothers learned the Book of the Dead. She learned the hymns to Hathor and the chants of Hurry-Shef. Her brothers wrestled and hunted with wooden spears in the garden. She embroidered lotus blossoms into cloth and practiced the art of kneeling correctly by age 10. She had perfected the art of silence. When visitors came, usually men in gold collars and ankle-length linen robes, she stayed inside. When decisions were made about her future, they were made in other rooms. Her name would be attached to contracts before she even reached puberty. By age 12, she was betrothed to a man she had never met. A merchant 2 decades her senior with a villa north of the city. It was not uncommon among Egypt's elite. T.S. words were valuable, not because of their voices, but because of their wombs and their alliances. Marriages were arranged to strengthen family ties. merge estates, curry favor with priests, or even settle quiet disputes. The girls themselves were like careful threads. If woven right, they would stabilize the tapestry. But what if the thread broke? In Tiamat's case, that unraveling began with a cough. It was small, at first barely audible, above the chants of the servants preparing incense for the family altar. But it deepened. Weeks passed. Her mother pressed warm cloths, soaked and honeyed, water to her chest. A priest was summoned. Offerings were made. Statue of Sekhmet, goddess of plague and healing, was placed in her room. Still, the cough remained. The physician trained more in ritual than in medicine. She had bad air in the chest. He prescribed a poultice of boiled dates and desert herbs. He recommended rest, but rest was all she ever did. As her body thinned, so did her chances. Whispers began to circulate. Would the merchant still want her? Would he accept a wife who coughed blood? Could a sickly girl be trusted to bear healthy sons? These were not cruel questions. They were practical ones. In a society where even the highest-born women were defined by their fertility, any sign of frailty could undo years of planning. Her betrothal was canceled quietly. A small shipment of linen and oil was sent to the merchant's estate as compensation. No blame was spoken aloud, but within the household, things changed. She was no longer a future wife. She was a problem. Rooms that once belonged to her were given to cousins. Her jewelry was no longer replenished. Her role shifted from daughter of promise to silent figure in the background. Her father barely looked at her. Her brothers forgot to greet her. She still performed her duties embroidering, grinding perfumed oil, singing softly during family festivals, but she no longer mattered. Not in the way she had once been told she would, and yet she remained. Unlike poorer women, she did not have the option of becoming a temple singer or a midwife. She had no skills allowed beyond the walls. She was a noble woman with no marriage, no title, and a reputation for being unwell. The most she could hope for was to become an aunt, helper in the background of someone else's story. There were many women like her. The ancient Egyptian record rarely speaks of them, but they existed. They appear in household roles, as unnamed dependents, in tomb paintings, as background figures. Their existence was quiet, but not meaningless. They watched, they remembered, they held together the rituals of daily life when the central players were too busy or too male to do so. Tiamat, too, became one of these background women. She took over the care of younger children in the family. She lit the lamps during household ceremonies. She organized the linens and made sure the family's offerings were placed on the altars with exacting neatness. No one praised her, but no one removed her either. This was the paradox of noble silence. A woman could be dismissed socially and still be absolutely essential in practice. Years passed. She remained unmarried. She grew thin but wise. She collected stories, whispered by servants and priests, listened more than she spoke. She knew when the family was in debt before her father did. She knew when a cousin's marriage was failing before the official gossip arrived. She became, in effect, the keeper of invisible knowledge. One day, her father died unexpectedly. The household shifted again. Her eldest brother, now the head of the family, inherited everything. There was no question of Tiamat inheriting land or property, not because it was forbidden, but because it was inappropriate for a woman whose value had long since been written off. She moved to a smaller room. The family's new wives took over the spaces she once cared for. Her status receded further, but there was a strange freedom in it, too. With no marriage contract to uphold, no childbearing expectation to meet, no husband to obey, she began to live a life unmeasured by public rituals. She chose her own hours. She spent long stretches of time near the gardens, staring at the reeds. She began recording prayers in her own voice, not for gods or ancestors, but for herself. little notes scratched onto shards of pottery, tucked away behind the stone basin in her room. I do not bear sons, but I carry memory. I have no husband, but I keep the flame. I was once meant to be traded, but I remained. By the time Tiamat was 40, she had outlived all expectations, still unmarried, still coughing, though more quietly. She became a kind of house deity, neither praised nor discarded, simply known. When she died, it was not in a great ceremony. Her burial was modest. A single servant carried her offerings. A faded amulet of Hathor rested on her chest. Name was not carved in stone, but in the household where she had once been forgotten, she was remembered, because in ancient Egypt, even silence had weight. When Tiamat's brother Kimhat inherited the household, it wasn't just walls and linen and servants he received. He inherited a legacy of duty of preserving the family name, maintaining the ancestral rituals, and continuing the lineage through sons. But behind those public expectations loomed private negotiations, and among the most delicate tasks was choosing a wife. He did not choose quickly. In noble Egyptian homes, marriage was never only a personal decision. It was a political and economic move, binding families together in subtle networks of influence. Kimhat considered daughters of scribes, merchants, and even distant relatives of the priesthood. Eventually, he selected Meritneith, a woman whose father was a temple official in Heliopolis, a city far to the north. Her dowry included fine linen, barley fields, and an entire chest of cedar-scented unguents. She arrived by boat, veiled, dressed in crisp pleated linen, with 2 servant girls in tow, in a look of mild resignation. She was barely 17. Kimhat was 20-9. He watched her arrive from a distance. Standing behind a carved pillar just inside the courtyard, she had not been asked to greet the new lady of the house. She had not been included in the planning, but she was there, observing. Over the weeks that followed, Tiamat noticed patterns. Meritneith walked too stiffly. She did not like the southern heat, nor the shape of the garden paths. She barely touched the roasted pigeon meat at dinner. She often lingered in the colonnade near the small papyrus pond, watching the water butt. Never entering it, she asked few questions. She received fewer answers. This was the normal awkwardness of a new bride settling into a household, some would say. But to Tiamat, who had learned to listen more than she spoke, it felt like a dissonant rhythm in a song that once played smoothly in this household. She had long since become invisible, too old to marry, too silent to question, and too familiar to fear. And because of this invisibility, she was able to hear everything. She heard the servants whisper about Meritneith's scrolls letters from Heliopolis that she kept hidden in the hem of her travel chest. She saw the merchant who came bearing gifts from Meritneith's father wine and perfume that were never shared with the rest of the household, but stored away in her private chamber. She noticed when Kimhat's attitude shifted when he began spending more nights in the upper hall, farther from his wife's chamber, when his voice became curt. By the second season of flooding, Meritneith had still not conceived. There were quiet rituals for that. Fertility statues, Hathor charms, incense burnt at dusk. Meritneith performed them dutifully, but without joy. Tiamat once caught her at the household altar, not praying, but staring, a hollow stare. Something was wrong, and, though no one said it aloud, Tiamat knew. Meritneith was waiting for something, not just a child, but permission to leave. Women in ancient Egypt had more legal rights than in many other ancient societies. A noble woman could initiate divorce, own property, and maintain her own dowry. But in practice, especially in high-status homes, these rights were entangled in obligation and shame. To leave a marriage so soon would humiliate her father. To stay might waste her youth. It was around this time that Tiamat stepped beyond her passive role. She did not act dramatically. That was not her way. Instead, she quietly visited Meritneith's chamber one morning under the pretense of delivering folded linens. She laid them on the cedar chest and waited. Meritneith, startled, looked up. "You aren't one of the servant girls," she said. "No," Tahima replied. "I was never married." There was a pause. In it, a strange recognition passed between them. Over the next few months, Tahimat became the only person Meritneith truly spoke to. She never shared the full story, but from scattered sentences and brief expressions, the truth became clear. Meritneith had not agreed to the marriage. She had been traded, sent away to resolve a debt between families, her dowry designed less for celebration and more as a repayment. Her father had gambled too deeply into temple politics, lost favor, and now she was the living cost of his mistake, and she wanted out. But there were no dramatic escapes in the lives of noble women. There were only legal maneuvers, quiet petitions, and long delays. Tahimat, cautious and methodical, offered something more subtle: documentation. In her younger years, she had watched scribes closely. She could not write full hieroglyphs, but she understood their forms. She had memorized household transactions, land arrangements, and the phrasing of contracts. Using Astraka pottery shards discarded by the kitchen, she began drafting a document, a record of mistreatment, a letter of appeal, a declaration that the union was not made freely. Over weeks, the draft evolved. Meritneith added tiny symbols she remembered from her father's house. Tahimat added contextual phrases. In time, the piece of pottery became a petition, one that could be delivered through the temple's minor priests to a legal scribe, then passed to the family of Meritneith's mother. It was not foolproof, but it worked. Response came delivered not by an official, but by a servant who had once worked in Heliopolis. A message. Her mother had received it. Arrangements would be made, and then, as quietly as she had arrived, Meritneith left. The household murmured. Kimhat did not speak of it. The official explanation was that the marriage was annulled due to a divine incompatibility, a phrase used when no fault could be assigned without shame. Her dowry was not returned. Life moved on. Kimhat remarried 2 years later. The new wife was younger, quieter, and from a less connected family. She bore sons within a year. But Tahimat never forgot the strange season when the walls whispered. She kept the final version of the petition hidden in her room, not for leverage, but for memory. And in the years that followed, she noticed something. New, younger women in the household began seeking her out. Not often, and never formally. But they came to ask about incense, to borrow combs, to sit in silence. And in those moments, Tahimat realized something else. Silence was no longer her burden. It was her language. By the time Kimhat's second wife had borne 2 sons, the household had begun to settle into a new rhythm, predictable and curiously quiet. There were no scandals, no absent brides, no murmured petitions. The garden was trimmed. More often, the servants moved with the practiced efficiency of people who had learned when to speak and when to vanish. But Tahimat, ever watching, ever quiet, knew that the walls had learned something. The long corridors that once echoed with restrained tension now carried a different sound: caution, not fear, exactly. More like a whisper of wariness, because Meritneith's departure had not gone unnoticed in the wider community. Temple attendants had whispered that the marriage had been annulled by private appeal. A few even claimed that the petition had been delivered without priestly permission, that it had traveled through servants, through women, in the bureaucratic mind of ancient Egypt. This was both unthinkable and oddly permissible. There were enough gray spaces in temple law, enough overlooked passages in the scrolls to allow something like this to happen without full outrage. But it unsettled those who preferred their hierarchies neat and their families quiet. Kimhot never acknowledged any of it. His second marriage was purposefully conventional, small dowry, no foreign connections, and a wife who barely left the women's quarters. He resumed attending official ceremonies and maintained his offerings to the gods. But Tiamat observed how he now sat differently at the dinner mat, how he glanced slightly at the hallway entrance, as though half expecting someone to appear. The second wife, Nebat, was young and eager to please. She spoke little and bore the weight of expectation without complaint, and in her silence, Kima saw a pattern repeat. Nebat bore her first child, a boy named Renan, a humid afternoon in the season of emergence. When the river had just begun to retreat, the birth had been hard, long, and dangerous. Tiamat, though not officially a midwife, was summoned to help boil water and prepare linens. She remained outside the birthing room, listening to the sounds, the low cries, the steady chants of the birth attendants, the occasional command from a supervising elder, and then the child's cry. Thin, reedy, but alive, Rena was placed in a swaddled basket and set in the upper chamber for protection. Offerings were made to Torit and Besta household gods of birth and protection. Small figurines were set around his mat to guard against evil. Tiamat helped clean the linens afterward, and as she wrung out the blood-stained cloths, she wondered, was this happiness? Was Nebat grateful or simply relieved? Weeks passed, and Nebat recovered slowly. She was praised for her endurance, given new perfumes, and presented with beads, but she seemed detached, like a girl still watching her own life from a distance. It was a familiar look. Tiamat began to spend more time near her chamber, not intrusively, but present. She offered to bring food, helped organize the linens, listened without speaking, and over time, Nebat began to speak. She asked about the layout of the estate, about the names of the gardeners, about the order of household offerings. But one afternoon, as they sat beside a basket of freshly pressed cloth, she asked something else. "Is it true," she said softly, "that a woman once left this place with her dowry intact?" Tiamat looked up. She did not nod. She did not speak, but Nebat saw the answer. She was brave, the younger woman whispered. "No," Tiamat said. She was very quiet. That was her power. In ancient Egypt, the legal frameworks for women's independence were clear on papyrus, but murkier in practice. A woman could own property, inherit land, initiate divorce, but only if she had access to scribes, to temple records, and to family, willing to support her claim. For women like Nebat, those doors existed in theory, but were often locked by silence and social obligation. Yet something subtle had shifted in this household. The servants now paused when Nebat passed. The steward gave her extra cloth for her son's bedding without being asked. The gardener let her pick herbs for healing. She had not demanded authority. She had simply been present, watchful, steady, and she had learned from Tiamat by the time Rena was walking. Nebat had become the quiet center of the household. Kimhot remained the master in name, but it was Nebat who managed the rhythms, who decided which days the meat would be salted, which priest would bless the offerings, which servant would carry gifts to the nearby shrine. Tiamat became her constant companion. She never took a formal title. She never asked for gifts, but her presence was respected. It was during one particularly hot week, the Nile wind dragging dust across the courtyards, that a message came. Merit Neith had died. The news arrived by way of a linen merchant who had traveled north and passed through Heliopolis. She had remarried briefly and then succumbed to an infection. No children, no known heirs. Nebat received the news in silence. She placed a small lotus flower in the pond at the edge of the garden. Tiamat watched it float for a long time, and then, without speaking, she rose and returned to her room. There, hidden beneath layers of folded cloth, was the original petition. the one she and Meredith had written. She unwrapped it, traced the faded symbols with her finger. Can considered burning it, but she didn't. Instead, she placed it in a small clay jar, sealed it with wax, and buried it beneath the threshold of the women's quarters. Not as a memory, as a warning. Years passed. Renna grew into a clever boy, then a curious young man. He was taught by temple scribes and shown the lineage records of his father's house. He knew his mother was respected, but he also understood that she had once lived in silence. And to Hemet, she became a kind of legend. Not the loud kind, the kind whispered about in kitchens. The kind who knew the names of herbs that eased labor pains, who could predict when the Nile would rise just from watching the ants, who knew what words to use when writing a letter that needed to be read but never traced. When she died, the household mourned her not with tears, but with silence. And in the decades that followed, girls were still promised before they could speak. Dowries still moved like river stones, slow and deliberate, but in this one household, deep in the southern bend of the Nile, something had shifted, because someone had once listened, and someone else had learned how to speak through silence. If you had walked along the muddy edge of the Nile in the season of heat, just as the sun began its slow rise behind the distant date palms, you might have seen them. Not dozens, not a crowd, just 5 or 6 figures bent over stones, slapping wet cloth against rock, thumbs rhythmically pulling fabric through water thick with silt and stories. They were the Herwomen, not priestesses, not noble daughters, not even market wives. These were the women who knew dirt better than scripture. Women who rose before the first birds sang and made their way to the river with bundles of linen, reed baskets, and knotted hair heavy with river mist, and their labor. It was invisible to most, because while the Egyptian nobility wore fine pleated garments and scented their clothes with crushed lotus, someone else had done the cleaning. Someone else had bent over the river for hours, rubbing fermented natron into stains that never fully left. Among them was a woman named Patti Tall, older than the rest and known for her silence. She didn't scold, didn't gossip, didn't even hum. But her arms were strong, her back never bowed, and when she placed a finished cloth on the drying rack, it stayed there, neatly folded, just right. Patti had not always been a washerwoman. Once she lived further upriver, married to a minor scribe who spent more time carving contracts than reading them. She had borne him 2 daughters, both of whom had died before their 7th named day, one from fever, the other from a poorly treated wound that festered in the summer heat. After that, Patti walked away. No one stopped her. There were no contracts forbidding her departure, no property that needed guarding, just grief, silence. She arrived in the small village of Permit, beside the riverbank, and the washerwomen took her in without question. There was always room for one more. The rules of their world were simple and unwritten. Newcomers were given the worst baskets and the heaviest loads. Only after a season could one graduate to better cloth, lighter stains. If you broke another woman's soap route, you owed her a week of drying duty. If your cloth floated downstream, it was your loss unless a crocodile took it, in which case it was considered an offering to Sobek. Each woman had her own patch of the river, unspoken borders marked by familiarity and habit. Katie's spot was beneath a low fig tree whose roots tangled into the bank like fingers. The others left it for her, not out of reverence, but out of an unspoken agreement. She had earned it. The work was monotonous and unforgiving. Soap root boiled into froth, natron rubbed into folds, scraping reeds used to tease out fibers, stones warmed by the sun used to pound out sweat and ash. Hours passed in silence, broken only by grunts, low conversation, and the slap of cloth against rock. Once a week, a small barge from the estate of a merchant named Harabin arrived, bringing linens stained with wine, sweat, blood, and occasionally guilt. The estate paid well, better than the temple laundries. But the women whispered about the marks they found, handprints on robes, strange cuts on tunics, symbols stitched and then removed. They didn't ask questions. They just scrubbed. Because in this world, the less you knew, the more you slept. Each of the washerwomen carried her own burden. One had a husband in the copper mines and hadn't seen him in 6 years. Another was raising her sister's 3 children. Another still claimed to have once washed the pharaoh's own linen, though no one ever challenged her, because who would bother lying about that? But Patti remained a mystery. She never explained her past, never corrected the others when they guessed. Some said she'd been a healer. Others claimed she'd been punished by a priest. One girl even swore she had seen Patti writing in the sand with his stick letters. Not symbols, just shapes. Patti had said, nothing worth reading. But when the river flooded, the year rising higher than the fig tree's roots bodies, silence broke. It was the middle of a morning shift. The water had been rising for days, bloated by early rains upriver. The currents had begun to pull reeds loose. Basket had already been lost. And then a child fell in. He wasn't one of theirs, just a village boy playing too close to the edge, his arms flailing, swallowed by the current before anyone could scream. The other women froze. Patti did not. She dropped her cloth, ran barefoot across the bank, and dove into the river. No hesitation, no shout, just motion. They saw her dark head surface once, then twice, then both the boy and the woman disappeared beneath a floating mat of lilies. Long moments passed, and then, against all sense, Patti emerged from the water, dragging the boy by. His arm, coughing, eyes bloodshot, shoulders heaving. She didn't wait for applause. She didn't even speak. She handed him to his mother, who had arrived screaming from the nearby village. And returned to her patch of river. The fig tree's roots had been torn up by the water. Her spot was gone, so she moved 3 feet downstream and started over. That was the day everything changed. The washerwomen began asking her opinion. They gave her first pick of soaproot. When Harabin's barge returned, she was the one who met the steward. She never spoke more than necessary. But her silence had become something else, respected. She was no longer a woman who had escaped grief. She was a woman who knew how to survive it. Later that year, when one of the girls fell ill, Patti was the one who brewed the tea. Not a temple brew. Something older, stronger. The girl survived. When a merchant's wife came demanding a torn hem be repaired before sundown, Patti stared her down without a word. The woman left, and when one of the washerwomen, a young widow named Enobiagan, asking about how to read numbers on linen tallies, it was Patti who quietly began drawing symbols in the sand behind the reed huts. She didn't say, this is the word for wet, or this is how you track baskets. She just showed them, and Eno learned. Soon, others asked. They called it cloth counting, but it was reading, because that's what Patti had once been, the wife of a scribe, in a world where women were taught to wash, to weave, to bear children, and to die quietly. She had chosen something else. She had chosen to remember. The Nile continued to rise and fall, bringing silt and fish and the bones of forgotten ancestors, but on its banks, the washerwomen of Permit slowly changed. They began keeping records. They started assigning numbers to baskets. They began refusing deliveries from men who underpaid. And when a temple official threatened to reassign their water access, they presented him with a signed clay tablet prepared, written, and sealed by women who had never seen the inside of a temple school. Patti did not sign it, but she had taught them how in the years that followed. Other villages sent their women to Permit to learn how to wash better, faster, smarter. They came to learn how to scrub blood from linen, but they stayed to learn how to write names that wouldn't be forgotten. And so, as the sun rose each day, casting gold across the muddy water and catching the shoulders of bent-backed women slapping linen against stone, there was something else in the air now. Not ambition, not rebellion, just memory. Memory carried in cloth, etched in reeds, preserved in the quiet, steady work of women who had learned that even the most invisible hands could leave a mark. Even those who never spoke. Even those who washed away everything. The Nile moved slowly in the season of harvest. Its waters had pulled back from the banks, revealing cracked mud and lost sandals, old fishing lines, and discarded bits of pottery. For the washerwomen, it meant longer walks from the huts to the sea edge of the water, their feet sinking into the spongy delta earth with every step. It also meant cooler mornings, stiffer cloth, and the return of merchant demands. The merchant Harbon's barge arrived precisely at the third morning after the full moon, just as the sun hovered like a dull bronze coin above the horizon. Steward, a lean man with sand-colored lashes and hands that smelled faintly of resin, stepped off with the usual bundle: fine linen robes, oil-stained tunics, a ceremonial sash spattered with dried myrrh, and one item that caused a stir: a blood-stained sheet, stiff and clotted. No explanation, no note, just folded cloth wrapped in silence. Potty took it, Wordlessly. She examined it under the slant of morning light. The stain had spread from the center outward, pale at the edges like smoke rings. It wasn't a wound from the battlefield. There were no slices, no arrow tears, no signs of a weapon's entry. Just blood, too much for a nosebleed, not enough for a fatal wound. A birthing cloth, perhaps, or a punishment. The others looked to Potty for her verdict, but she said nothing. Instead, she soaked it overnight in a basin of crushed lotus and vinegar, scrubbing with flat stones until her knuckles turned pale. The next morning, the stain remained faint but present, and so it went into the drying line Isis, a warning in fibers. That week, Potty began something new. It wasn't announced. There was no ceremony. She simply began keeping a record, a ledger, not in papyrus, which was expensive and delicate, but in carved lines on clay, soft, unfired river mud, shaped into long, flat tiles. Each tile no longer than a forearm, marked with symbols, etched with reed tips, and wrapped in rushes to dry. Every cloth that arrived from the merchant, she recorded: number of items, types of stains, whether it came with a mark of payment, whether it had a scent. The other washerwomen called it her stain scroll. At first, they laughed quietly, but within a few weeks, they noticed something strange. Potty could predict when a delivery was due simply by tapping a tile and whispering dates under her breath. She knew which robes belonged to which official in the merchant's household. She could tell whether a garment had been in a fight, a ritual, or a bedroom. Patterns began to emerge. One steward's robes always had oil around the collar. Another wore linen to shear for temple events. A particular sash came back every month, with candle soot along the hem. Potty wasn't just washing anymore. She was reading the stains, interpreting them like a priestess reading entrails, and others began to follow. Inu, the young widow with quick hands and sharper eyes, began sketching little marks into the clay beside Potty. She started tracking which women were assigned to which batches, teased how many bundles they processed in a week, how many hours they worked. The ledger grew from 1 tile to 5, then 10. They began to organize the drying racks differently, not by size or owner, but by stain type. Blood in one area, sweat in another. Dyes and perfumes separated to avoid contamination. It was efficiency born from necessity, but something more, too. It was structured, order, power. In a world where women were often left to react to pregnancies, to beatings, to debts, to floods. This was action. Preemptive, controlled, predictive. One morning, when a new steward from Harabin's estate arrived and claimed they had forgotten to include a ceremonial belt in last week's delivery, Spotty stepped forward with a clay tile. She pointed to a mark. Belt, not delivered. The steward scowled. You cannot know this. She didn't argue. She simply showed the roll. 5 garments listed, only 4 received. Inunu, she called. You counted it. Yes, the younger woman replied, unfazed. We noted it on the 10th day after the last flood. No belt. The steward left quiet, confused, and slightly embarrassed. 3 days later, the belt arrived with double the usual pay. That's when the village began to notice. Not just the barge crews, but the scribes, the elders. Even the head of the local Fishers Guild came one day to see how the washerwomen marked their tallies. How do you keep the clay from cracking? He asked. Potty looked up from her carving. Mix ash with silt, less shrinkage, and so, like a quiet tide, knowledge began to flow outward. The washerwomen taught others how to track fish weights, how to mark rainfall, how to preserve symbols on broken pottery. Not in classrooms, not in temples, but on the edges of baskets, inside storage pits, and along the mud brick walls of reed huts. Meanwhile, Harabin's steward returned with an offer. Would the washerwomen come to the estate, clean linens on site, for better pay, under supervision? Potty refused. She didn't shout, didn't give a speech. She simply wrote a message in clay. We work from the river. Linen washed in clean current. We do not move. It was signed by all 7 women each, one adding her name, or mark, or symbol. The steward took it without comment. A month passed. Then too, when he returned again, he brought not a demand, a tribute, a basket of new soaproot, still fragrant with bloom, a note scrawled by an estate scribe, for the washerwomen of permit. The river will wait. So it was. They didn't expand their operation, didn't build a school, didn't start a revolution. They just kept working, stone by stone, cloth by cloth, mark by mark, and within that quiet rhythm, a new kind of power emerged. Not the kind earned in courts or temples, not the kind sealed by rings or priests, but the kind etched into daily labor, into slow, stubborn persistence, that comes from knowing more than others think you do, and from choosing when and how to show it. One day, a passing scribe, a friend of Eno's cousin, asked if the washerwomen would consider sending their ledger to the city archives in Memphis. It's a fine example, he said, of feminine record-keeping. A curiosity. Potty smiled, and then she dropped the tile into the river. Let it sink, because this was never about legacy. It was about control, the kind you carry in your hands, not in scrolls, the kind you fold and scrub and squeeze, the kind you choose not to explain. The final section of this quiet account begins where the river always starts in silence. Not the silence of stillness, but the kind that builds from repetition, from the same feet pressing into the same earth, from hands dipping cloth into current before the sun rises, from years of murmured rituals and half-finished songs carried on the breeze and forgotten before they reached the opposite bank. By now, washerwomen's way of working had grown so orderly, so consistent, it was nearly invisible. The villagers no longer pointed when they walked by. Children no longer asked what they were doing. They became part of the river's memory and expected rhythm like the tide that crept up the reeds, but the silence deepened in other ways. 2. One morning, the bundles stopped arriving from Harabin's estate. No steward, no robes, just the stillness of absence. At first, they thought it was a delay. A barge held up in shallows, or perhaps a funeral in the household. But after 10 days, Enu took the clay tile, marked it with a flat line, and whispered, "No delivery." They waited. 2 more weeks. Still nothing. Then came the rumors. Reuben, the merchant, had fallen from favor. Or perhaps not fallen, but vanished. Some said he'd been summoned to the capital for an inquiry. Others claimed a theft had been uncovered, gold bars missing from under temple seal. There were whispers of poison, a betrayal, too many secrets buried in the fibers of linen. Patty said nothing. She simply removed the tiles, marked with his name from the shelf, and pressed them flat into the mud. No fire, no preservation. The river would reclaim them in time. Still, the absence left a gap. The washerwomen returned to their usual clients' barge crews, temple attendants, midwives. The flow of garments resumed, but never with the same complexity. Harabin's robes had carried politics in their folds, alliances in their perfume. These new bundles were simpler, cleaner in more ways than one, but something had shifted. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the palm trunks, an elder named Jedmat, who had not worked cloth in 20 years, approached the drying racks. "Remember you," she said to Patty. "You were just a girl when I left." Patty looked up. "Han, now I am a stone." Jedmat laughed. "You always were. Stones can be worn smooth." She paused, then continued. "You keep records." "We did," Patty replied, "but not for the archives." "Good," said the old woman. "That describes chase there, shadows. But you," she reached for a corner of linen, ran her finger along the stitched edge. "You've trapped time in this cloth. Not just stains, gestures, wounds, secrets." And then she said something strange. "They will come for you." The next day, a new man arrived. Not a steward, but an official. His robe was crisp, too crisp for the river's edge. He didn't speak at first, just watched from a distance as the women worked. Then he approached with a scroll, sealed in red. "I come on behalf of the House of Provisions," he announced. "We are establishing new methods of accounting for temple goods. We've heard that women here keep records." "No," he glanced at Padi. The older woman didn't look up. "We keep stains." The official frowned. "Excuse me? Stains?" she repeated. "Not scrolls." There was an awkward silence. Then the man cleared his throat and produced a second scroll. "We ask only for observation. A week, maybe 2. It's time." Patty stood. "Why?" The official blinked. "To improve oversight, ensure fairness, perhaps even train others." Patty nodded slowly. "You want to watch us work?" "Yes." "To learn?" "Yes." "To take what we've built?" He hesitated. "We want to replicate success." Gand. There it was. The word that changed everything. Replicate. Not honor, not support, not reward. Replicate. The river breeze shifted. The other women stopped washing. One by one, they gathered, cloths still wet in their hands. Patty turned to them. "We'll keep working," she said. And then to the official, "You may observe, but you will not interrupt." So he sat. Every day, for 7 days, the man arrived, with his scribes and parchments, recording everything: the time of delivery, the weight of cloth, the order of drying, the method of stain classification. He asked questions. "Okay." At first, the washerwomen answered simply, "Okay." But over time, the responses grew shorter, cooler. By the end of the week, he was writing without speaking. On the final day, he stood before Patty and bowed. "Your work is remarkable." She did not return the gesture. "But it will not be remembered," he added. This caught her attention. "Why?" He gave a sad smile. "Because it lives in cloth, in hands, in silence." Then he walked away. The women said nothing for hours. But that night, Patty lit a small oil lamp and began carving again, not into clay, but into wood. A narrow beam from a broken oar, scrubbed clean and dried in sun. She carved the names of the women she had worked with, then the marks for each year they had labored. Then, slowly, the symbols for their methods, the bundles, the stains, the river cycles. The board grew heavy in her lap. She didn't know if it would survive the years, or if anyone would understand it, but it was a counterweight to silence. And in the morning, she buried it beneath the largest washing stone, where the tide only reached on flood days. Years passed. The river changed course slightly. A new path formed closer to the palm groves. Fewer deliveries came now. People washed their own cloth, or sent it to newer, faster workshops upriver. The washerwomen aged. Some left. Some died. Some vanished into the slow forgetting of village time. Eno stayed longest. She tended the drying lines even when her fingers ached and her knees cracked in the cold morning mud. She taught a few girls, but none stayed more than a season. The world had grown too fast for clay tiles and vinegar soaks. One day, the washing stone cracked. A boy, skipping stones, struck it hard enough to break the surface. Beneath it, he found the carved, beam-weathered, worn, but still legible. He brought it to the village elder, who brought it to a traveling scribe, who sent it to a scholar in Heliopolis. The scholar declared it a curiosity, a proto-ledger of domestic labor. He wrote, likely the work of a priestess or widow. Unclear. He filed it away. Eventually, it was forgotten, until one day, centuries later, a fragment of the beam was uncovered in a dig outside the old river path, its carvings still faintly visible. No names, no dates, just the grooves of a system that lived in women's hands, a way of reading the world through its leftovers. A life of logic carved into laundry, in the silence that lingered in cloth, not empty, not passive, but full of knowledge no one had asked for and too often ignored. You wouldn't know it by the way the temple rose from the earth solid, unbending, shadowed by pillars carved to look like papyrus stalks, but inside, everything changed as quickly as the Nile's floodplain. One moment you were favored, the next you were furniture. This was especially true if you were a woman. Even more so if you were a priestess. The gods were eternal. Their moods were not. Naboth, daughter of a modest scribe and an herbalist, had not been born into power, but she had a gift of nose like no other in the district of Akhmim. From childhood, she could detect the difference between sacred frankincense and common resin. She knew the exact boiling point when blue lotus yielded its oil. She once identified a spoiled jar of myrrh just by the way it sounded when shaken. By 13. She was taken into the house of Lifta, section of the temple where scribes and healers lived. By 16, she'd been promoted to the temple of Men, the fertility god. There, she was trained to craft ritual perfumes, ointments, and incense for festivals and embalming rites. By 20, Naboth was known as the temple's nose. It was not meant as an insult. The older priests whispered it with a mix of reverence and superstition. She didn't speak much, didn't write down her recipes, didn't argue when her blends were credited to others. But she knew things. When the sacred oils were off by a few drops, she adjusted them by scent alone. When the offerings in the inner chamber failed to please the god, judged by omens, temple animals, or the priest's dreams, it was she who recalibrated the perfume placed at the altar. And when the embalmers needed to mask the rot of royal bodies, they turned to her not just for cover scents, for concoctions that slowed decay. For a time, she was untouchable, but favor in a temple was a thing of wind and whispers. One season, the high priest was replaced too old, they said, too stuck in his ways. The new priest, Hedi, came from a distant province and had no use for incense rituals older than himself. He wanted order, paperwork, protocol. He brought his own perfumer, a man trained in Memphis who measured everything by weight and time. He called Naboth's blends folkloric, Her adjustments, guesswork. At first, Nabat remained silent. Let him spill oils, let him overheat the lotus. But the temple's moods shifted. Less respect, fewer requests. Her clay vessels were moved to a darker corner of the storehouse. One morning, she arrived to find her name removed from the roster of offerings. That evening, she walked alone to the edge of the sacred lake. Not to weep, but to smell. The lotus. Flowers were beginning to wilt. The air had changed. She knew this season, and she knew what came. So she waited. Weeks passed, and then came the drought, a failed flood. The Nile had not risen high enough. Crops withered. Offerings dwindled. The temple panicked. The high priest held emergency rites. New perfumes, new chants, new blends. But the god remained silent. No dreams, no omens, no answers. Finally, someone remembered Nebat. She was summoned at dusk. Hetty waited, expression unreadable. "We ask your counsel," he said. Nebat didn't bow. She stepped into the storeroom and began sniffing. She moved like someone remembering a song, pausing, circling, retracing steps. Then she stopped at a cracked jar of juniper oil. "Who sealed this?" she asked. No one answered. "It's been tainted," she said. "Open the rest." They did. 6 vessels all corrupted, a batch from the Memphis perfumer's new supplier. The scent was raw, not rotten, but distracted, wandered in the nose, refusing to anchor. Nebat returned to her corner and pulled down a cloth bundle. Inside were dried fragments, resins, petals, roots. She worked by lamplight, adding oil drop by drop, crushing pods with a flat stone, stirring with a reed stalk dot at dawn. She handed Hetty a single vial. "Place this beside the statue," she said. He did. That night, the priest dreamed. He saw men, radiant and wordless, standing in a field of smoke. The god opened his arms, then the dream ended. In temple records, this was marked as the renewal. For a few weeks, Nebat was spoken of again, never credited directly. The perfumes returned to her formula, but her name did not. Still, she resumed her post, because the air was wrong again. That's what she told the apprentice who shadowed her one evening. "The air changes before the temple does," she murmured. But no one listens to silence. Her blends, once heavy and sensual, became sharper, drier, more defensive. She added bitter almond to the embalming oils, ground acacia thorns into her protection charms, infused smoke with vinegar. It confused the priests, but not the women. A few days later, a girl from the house of weavers came to her at night, quietly, pale. Nabet offered her no questions, only ointment. Then a midwife came, then a widow, then a water-dash bearer. Each carried bruises they did not speak of. Each left with a balm, charm, or a salve hidden inside something else. Word spread, but no one spoke it aloud. They called her the breath beneath the temple. She wasn't healing anymore. She was resisting, not openly, just enough. When the new steward brought her a shipment of myrrh and asked her to sign the inventory, she refused. "It smells wrong," she said. He insisted. She declined again. Later, that week, the jar was opened, contained olive oil, thickened with ashdot after that. Fewer orders came through official channels. She didn't mind. The temple had grown too loud. Anyway, too full of names and too empty of scent. Her corner became quieter, more still, until one morning she was gone. No record, no punishment, no farewell, just an empty mat and a cold lamp. Some said she'd been transferred to another district. Others said she'd walked into the sacred lake and vanished. Years later, when the temple storehouse was being cleaned out, a novice found a hidden shelf behind the drying herbs. Inside were bundles, small packets of dry materials wrapped in papyrus, each labeled not with ink, but with fragrance. You could tell what they were only by sniffing. They were blends for mourning, for birth, for bruises, for forgetting. No one recorded them. No one dared burn them. So they were buried, not in a tomb, but in the hollow base of the broken pillar outside the northern gate. No names, no hieroglyphs, only the scent of resistance, still lingering when the wind was right. The older the temple grew, the more it forgot. New stewards came and went. Priests were promoted or exiled. Titles shifted. Ledgers changed hands. But certain things remained, like the way shadows moved across the outer columns during the equinox, or how the birds stopped singing just before the solstice incense was lit. And kin time, Nebat became one of those things. Not a person, not even a priestess, a pattern. She was not mentioned by name in any festival scrolls, or carved into the side of any votive stele. But the women who came to sweep the courtyards or refilled the oil lamps would sometimes speak of her as one speaks of a seasonal present, expected, returning, gone again. The corner where she once sat was never reassigned. Dust gathered, and no novice dared light a lamp in that alcove. But her scent returned, faintly, always faintly. The oil from her vanished recipes began to reappear, though never officially. No one confessed to having replicated them. No one even claimed to remember how. But the embalmers started using cedar again in their salves. The protective ointments for pregnant women smelled more like wormwood and less like sweet myrrh. And at a small altar tucked beside the southern gate, a persistent smell of crushed tamarisk could be detected in the offerings, though. Tamarisk was not among the standard temple ingredients. Some said it meant she had never left. Others said it meant someone else had picked up where she stopped. The truth may lie in a strange clay tablet discovered in a grain store ledger years later. Not an official document, but something scrawled in haste on the back of a broken writing shard. The glyphs were clumsy and uneven, but the message read, "The oil that stops pain must be cooled under moonlight or it curdles. The bomb is not in the plant, but in the silence of boiling. Wait until the second crackle." No scribe would write that. No steward would understand it, but any midwife would, and it matched exactly the strange behavior observed around the temple kitchens that summer. Water jars left outside at night, then poured over specific herbs before dawn. Empty pottery vessels hung from cords in quiet corners, absorbing whatever breeze the temple caught, and dried marjoram left between the stone cracks in the women's quarters, something never mentioned in medicine scrolls, but well known among the older herbalists for soothing menstrual cramps. By then, the temple had grown colder in other ways. Fewer pilgrims arrived. The floods were irregular. Offerings shrank. Priests began pushing for grander festivals to restore attention. Larger sacrifices, kegger flames. But the women knew, the quiet ones, the ones who fetched oil, not gave sermons. They passed scraps of parchment back and forth. Not scrolls, not sacred text, but recipes written in symbols, scent marks, not words. A spiral meant stir while warm. A bird meant cool quickly. A fish meant don't say anything out loud. Nebat's system may be, or someone else's. It no longer mattered. The system had outlived its name. This form of scent, quieting if one can call it, that was not language, not officially, but it was memory. And memory, in a temple, is more dangerous than protest. One girl, an apprentice lamb tender named Hinty, began collecting these scraps in a jar. She didn't understand all of them, but she arranged them by scent. A bundle for headaches, a bundle for afterbirth, bundle for night terrors. She kept them under her mat, and as she grew older, she began experimenting. Not grand things, tiny acts. She would adjust the lamp oils to release softer fragrances in the evening hours, fewer headaches for the women sleeping nearby. She started biting her own chest with cloths soaked in vinegar. and powdered mints, something Nebat was once rumored to do to delay menstruation during long fasting rites, and once when a young novice was found crying silently in the linen room. Henty didn't speak. She just left a tiny pouch, a pinch of ground resin, a soft cloth, and a single tamarisk cod. No one ever said what it was for, but the novice stopped crying the next day. Still, the temple was not a forgiving place. Small comforts did not make up for large expectations. One year, a new decree arrived from the palace. All temples were to account for their medicinal inventories. A royal physician, appointed by decree, would tour the sanctuaries and report irregularities. The visiting physician, Jehudamos, was stern, tidy, and deeply uncomfortable in the presence of female scribes. He toured the workshops briskly. When he came to the women's quarter, he hesitated. The women paused their duties. All eyes were lowered. But when he came to the storage alcove, the one no one had touched since Nebat's time, he sneered. "What is this?" he asked. No one answered. He moved to inspect it. A novice knocked over a clay bowl, spilling water across his path. It was not an accident. By the time it was cleaned up, he had forgotten about the alcove. The incident was minor, but Henty did not sleep for days afterward. She began to transfer the scent scraps from under her mat to hidden places. One bundle inside the lining of an old sandal, one pressed between two layers of an unused scroll, one burned to ash in a slow incense ritual. Its fragrance never repeated. Years passed. The temple shrank in influence. The men were replaced by younger men. The rituals grew shorter. The walls cracked, but the women remained. Not as names, but as gestures. Someone still left marjoram at the door during the new moon festival. Someone still adjusted the lamp oils, and every so often, when a new novice arrived, she would find a tiny, cloth-wrapped bundle under her sleeping mat. No note, no instructions, only the scent of something that had been waiting for her. The smell of crushed tamarisk had faded. A corner where Nebat once prayed was colder now, but it wasn't forgotten. Not in the way forgotten things usually are. You might imagine her name being whispered behind temple pillars, during moonless nights by women grinding herbs with bone-worn fingers. But that's not how these things work. Not when survival depends on silence. No one spoke of her directly. Instead, it moved around her memory like one might move around a hidden spring in the desert, never acknowledging it aloud, yet always knowing where to drink. And as the temple slid further into disrepair, something else bloomed quietly beneath. The decay. A parallel memory system. One built not from scrolls or statues or tomb inscriptions, but from rhythm, timing, routine. The scent rituals Nebat once whispered into the pores of temple stone had become habit, not rule, not rebellion, just ... pattern ... women's folded linens in certain ways, crushed herbs in silence on certain days, left offerings not to the gods, but to the empty spaces left behind by forgotten priestesses. There's a kind of power in that. It's a kind that doesn't ask permission. It's a kind that survives precisely because it remains unspoken. And for a while, that was enough until the reforms came. You see, temples in Egypt were never just places of worship. They were banks, libraries, medical clinics, storage houses. They held land, employed laborers, maintained gardens, administered rites that regulated not only life, but the afterlife. So, when a new pharaoh, young, devout, and desperate to reclaim lost authority, demanded a full review of temple operations, things shifted. Each sanctuary was told to align its rituals with the state-approved rites. Every priest was to be recertified, and most importantly, every unauthorized practice, especially those carried out by women, was to be documented or destroyed. For Henty and the other quiet practitioners, this posed a problem. They had no records, only bundles, pouches, scents, and memories. and memories don't translate well on paper. The first inspection came on a market day. Men from the southern districts, scribe trainees, unfamiliar with temple rhythmer, arrived just after dawn. They brought scrolls, wax, tablets, seals, but no incense, no respect, no quiet. They asked strange questions. Who manages the female quarters ointment ratios? What's the source for this cedar resin? Why are there no records of your binding powders? The women answered in half phrases and shrugs. They showed the official recipe scrolled sterile, complete, and when asked about the tamarisk, offerings, or cooling jars, they smiled politely and said, "The wind must have blown it there." But the scribes were not fools. One, a young man named Penetra, lingered longer than the others. He picked up one of the hidden scraps from behind a stone basin, held it to his nose, paused, then, wordlessly, placed it back where he found it. That night, no women spoke, but the oil in the lamps burned deeper than usual. The next inspection came with warnings. The scribes would now search private quarters. This time, no tricks, no spilled water to distract, no clever footwork. Henty, now nearing the end of her apprenticeship, gathered her remaining scent bundles. She did not bury them. She didn't try to destroy them. She simply gave them away. One to a washerwoman whose daughter was pregnant. One to an old herbalist who still worked with toothaches and burns. One her favorite, a folded cloth containing a crushed blue lotus petal, was left inside the hollow of a sun-dried brick in the temple wall by the time the scribes returned. Her mat was empty, and she answered every question with the same phrase. "I don't recall," 'cause she didn't, not exactly. She didn't know the ratios anymore, didn't remember whether the resin was boiled or baked, had forgotten which breeze mattered, and that ironically made her safe. What cannot be recalled cannot be punished. Still, the memory of Nebet remained, even after Henty aged into the role of lamp mistress, even after the state sealed the courtyard, where women once cooked their oils, even after they reassigned the outer rooms to bureaucrats, replacing clay incense bowls with logbooks. Even then, something lingered. Visitors few, though they were reported strange things. A sudden calm upon entering the side corridor, a faint smell, sweet and earthy, in the darkest corners, and occasionally, a moment during the evening rites when the wind would blow from the wrong direction, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of tamarisk and vinegar. No one explained it, no one asked, and that is how Nebat vanished. Not in disgrace, not in exile, but into ritual, into repetition, into the unnoticed, the unsanctioned, the unofficial. She became the rhythm of things done gently, without instruction, the pause between a question and an answer, the silence before dawn, the last drop of oil before sleep. And if you've ever walked into a room and smelled something you couldn't place, something both ancient and familiar, it may be that you, too, have found one of her bundles. Or perhaps you haven't. Perhaps the wind just blew strangely that day. You've likely heard of Deir el Medina, the village tucked into a valley on the west bank of the Nile, where the artisans who built the pharaoh's tombs lived. But you've probably only heard about the men, the master painters, stone cutters, scribes. Their names were written in official records, on astraka, and preserved on the walls of the tombs they themselves decorated. But what about their wives, their daughters, the women who carried water to the basins, soothed fevers under the desert sun, tended to the quiet illnesses that came from breathing powdered stone for too many years? They weren't buried in the Valley of the Kings. They weren't painted onto limestone panels. They didn't leave behind hymns or building receipts. Most were buried just beyond the edge of the village, in hastily dug, shallow plots covered with mats or broken roof tiles. Sometimes not even that, but that's where the story begins. Not with names, but with traces. and one trace barely legible, carved into a worn wooden tags. Simply read, woman, age not known, swelling in the feet, midwife's cloth beside her. All we know, not a name, not a year, just a symptom, okay, and a cloth. But if you stop here, you miss the point. Because in a place like Deir el Medina, where every wall was meant to last for eternity, the absence of a name might say more than a full inscription. Let's step back. Life in the workers' village was tightly regulated. The entire settlement functioned like a gated labor camp, overseen by royal officials. Food was rationed. Scribes kept daily logs. Workers were assigned shifts 8 days on, 2 days off. To everything that mattered to the state was recorded. So when someone wasn't recorded, they either didn't matter to the state, or they were actively erased. Women in Deir el Medina did appear in some records, but usually in the margins. Wife of so-and-so, mother of the stonemason, accused of brewing beer without license, or, in one case, borrowing a neighbor's amulet and not returning it. But the deeper work, the everyday management of life, wasn't recorded. Not the laundry, boiled under the noon sun. Not the skin cracked from hauling water in palm fiber ropes. Not the miscarriages that happened in silence. Not the midwife who arrived at the wrong time, too late to save anyone. So who was she, this unnamed woman with swollen feet? Let's begin with the feet. Edema, as it's called now, could result from dehydration, pregnancy complications, or heart failure. But in ancient Egypt, it might have meant something else. Swollen feet could signal a life of standing. Long hours in uneven sandals, carrying loads across packed earth, grinding grain at a slanted board, toes pressed into the dirt for balance. Not glamorous, not ceremonial, just survival. And the cloth beside her. That detail is what anchors her to history, because midwives in Egypt often carried simple linen cloths soaked with oil or water used to clean, bind, comfort. She might have died attending a birth, or after her own. We'll never know. But here's what we do know. Her grave was located in the lower western ridge of the workers' village necropolis. The site was once a garbage heap. Later, it became the only place available for the very poor. No tomb walls, no offerings. It's just earth. And yet, someone left her a burial, a cloth, a note. And that's the miracle of boring history. Because in a civilization that carved power into stone, it's the soft traces fabric, forgotten names, dismissed ailments that tell us who did the actual work of keeping life going. These women were not temple dancers, not royal wives. They were not immortalized in myth. They were the ones who made sure the children lived long enough to learn how to paint falcons, who made poultices when sandstone dust filled the mason's lungs, who negotiated with the ration keepers for extra oil, when a neighbor's baby wouldn't stop crying, and when their own time came, there was no elaborate rite. No golden coffin, just a wrapped body in a ditch, maybe a prayer spoken, and then a return to work. One ostracon found in the ruins of a domestic dwelling reads, "It was hot. She bled much. I made her lie still. The child lived." That's it. No signature, but someone thought to write it down, not for glory, not for official record, just so the moment wouldn't vanish completely. And that is where we end for now, with a nameless woman, buried in the margins, who likely helped deliver others into this world, while no one stood to deliver her safely into the next. Let's return to the woman they didn't name. Her feet were swollen. A midwife's cloth lay beside her. And someone, no one knows who, buried her quietly outside the walls of Deir el Medina, where the refuse piles once rose like dunes of broken pottery and ash. But before that grave, before that final moment, she lived. And like many women in ancient Egypt, she likely carried a knowledge so deeply embedded in her hands and eyes that no scribe ever thought to record it. Midwifery wasn't an occupation one studied formally. was taught through repetition, passed from older women to younger ones, learned by watching, by listening, by surviving. So, imagine her now, in death, but in motion. It's still early morning, before the full heat. The limestone walls of the long, narrow houses of Deir el-Medina hold on to the night's coolness, but the air is already dry. A child cries. Somewhere, a fire is being coaxed back to life from last night's embers. Adet. She is being called. There's a woman in labor. Second child. First one, born breech. This one has been slow to move. She doesn't pack a bag. She knows what to bring. A linen cloth, a small jar of fat, perhaps a string of beads blessed by the household, gods, and her hands. That's what matters. The passageways between homes are tight, barely space for two people to walk shoulder to shoulder. She slips through the gaps, avoiding loose bricks, stepping over discarded bits of plaster. When she arrives, she greets the mother softly, noting the sheen of sweat on her forehead, the way her fingers curl toward her belly. She says very little. Midwives in this village rarely spoke unless needed. Words could unsettle the fragile rhythm of a birth in this moment. Her knowledge, passed on through generations of women who never wrote anything down, is what makes her powerful, and yet invisible. There were no temples to midwives, no tax exemptions, no record of employment. But without them, there would have been no tomb painters, no stone carvers, no future scribes. Her hands would know how to massage the lower back when labor slowed, how to place warm oil near the birth canal to ease the tearing. She would know the smell of a difficult delivery, how it changes subtly, from the sweat of pain to the sharper note of infection. And she would recognize the silences too, when a cry didn't come, when a breath didn't catch. Most births in Deir el-Medina, as in all of ancient Egypt, happened in the home. Wealthier women in urban Thebes might have had access to more elaborate birthing beds made of clay bricks or wood arranged to support the back. But here, in the dusty workers' village, it was more likely a reed mat on the floor, a stool, if they were lucky. Privacy, almost never. Birth was a communal act. Female neighbors gathered not just to help, but to witness, to testify that the child had entered the world alive. This wasn't simply a social tradition, it had legal consequences. Without witnesses, the child's birth might not be accepted by inheritance laws. The midwife knew this. She was not just a healer. She was a record keeper in flesh. Still, if something went wrong, if the mother bled too much, or the child was born lifeless, she bore the shame, not the family, not the gods. Her, even though the real causes were biological, unpredictable, and largely misunderstood by the medicine of the time. What was her protection? Sometimes amulets. The ancient Egyptians believed that birthing was a dangerous liminal space between life and death, and divine figures were invoked for protection. Torith, the hippo-shaped goddess with a swollen belly, was one such protector. So was Base, a dwarf-like god with a lion's mane and protruding tongue, meant to scare away malevolent spirits. Our midwife may have kept a clay figurine of Base near her birthing cloths, not because she believed it would save a life, necessarily, but because others believed. And belief, even more than balm, was often the first treatment. But belief did not prevent death. And in a village like Deir el-Medina, where life was hard and burial plots were rationed, a midwife's failure, real or imagined, might mean the end of her work. We find clues of this in the scribe's complaint records. One fragment, broken at the edge, describes a man requesting that his wife not be treated again by the woman with unclean hands who brought death in the third moon. Was that our woman? We'll never know. But we do know that failure clung like dust in the hot air, settling on everything. Sometimes women were buried with charms in their graves, tiny ivory tusks or flat stones painted with symbols of fertility. But our woman wasn't. No charms were found, just that cloth, And here's the irony. Though no one wrote her name, someone placed that cloth beside her. Someone knew what it meant. A neighbor, a daughter, another midwife. Perhaps it was simply left there because no one could bear to throw it away. Maybe it had been soaked through too many times with other women's fear. Maybe it was a way of saying you mattered, even if they never said so. You may wonder, then why didn't she leave? Why stay in a place where your work could end in blame, where your body could be buried in rubbish ground? But where would she go? Women in Egypt didn't travel alone. They couldn't own property without complex legal arrangements. And midwives weren't paid in coin. They were compensated in bread, oil, perhaps the promise of future favor. She had no riches, no documents, no status, only experience. And in this world, experience left no mark unless carved into stone. Unless someone like you, centuries later, chooses to pause, test, who were the ones that made life possible without ever being given life in return? Who were the ones that folded the cloth, not to clean a wound, but to send a woman quietly into the earth? And, most haunting of all, how many more lay buried just beyond the edge of the map, their stories lost not because they weren't written, but because no one thought they were worth writing. There's a silence that lingers in archaeological records, and it's the silence of people who were never expected to leave a trace. The woman buried outside the walls of Dia el Medina may not have had a tomb with inscriptions. She may not have owned a statue or even a name carved into wood, but what remained the cloth, the placement of her body, and the faint clues from the soil were enough to speak. We returned to her grave, a shallow one, dug near the slope where discarded tools, broken amphorae, and rejected offerings were once thrown. It's a space that archaeologists didn't notice at first. Most looked toward the tombs, the finely decorated chambers of foremen and scribes. The painted walls of those tombs told stories of orderly life, gods, judgment, harvests, and eternal peace. But this was just a hole in dry earth. What made it strange was the linen. Egyptologists noticed that it wasn't burial linen like the kind used in mummification. It was thicker, more worn, more practical. It's like something from a household, not a temple. And it was folded, not wrapped, placed at the side of the body, near the hips. Why? That question would take decades to surface. At first, the assumption was simple. A poor burial, perhaps a servant, perhaps an outsider. But when researchers looked closer, when they compared the soil samples and noticed traces of iron, of repeated biological residue, they realized this wasn't just a grave, it was a message, in ancient Egyptian daily life. Linen wasn't just fabric, it was currency, memory, and symbol. A midwife's cloth wasn't just a towel, it absorbed history. The folds of that cloth may have cradled dozens of newborns. It may have carried the breath of women, gasping in labor. It may have been washed in the river beside whispers and songs now lost to time. Someone buried that cloth with her because they knew that was her story. But why no name? You might imagine that all Egyptians had names. A Tivanapur had at least a pottery shard or fragment noting who they were. But not always. In Deir el Medina, names were a kind of currency. Scribes recorded who got what rations, which workers skipped duty, who was sick, who was absent. These names entered records for economic reasons, not sentimental ones. Women especially. Those without husbands or sons often vanished from the papyri altogether. If she had no legal ties, no outstanding debts, no family to speak of, her name could have disappeared in her own lifetime. She may have been known only by a title. The birthbringer, the housewoman, is that one with the quick hands. And when death came, that title, too, dissolved. But she wasn't alone in this. Archaeological records show dozens of unnamed female burials outside formal cemeteries, many with signs of intense labor-related stress. Worn knees, arthritic hands, pelvis bones changed by repeated squatting, broken teeth from malnutrition. Some were buried near the town, others in the fields, most with no grave goods, no hieroglyphs, just bodies and earth, and yet, together, they form a pattern, a map, a forgotten service. Imagine, now, her final days. Had she fallen ill after a difficult birth? Perhaps an infection took hold, the kind we treat now with antibiotics, but that then moved fast, swelling the body, dimming the eyes. Maybe the birth wasn't her own. Maybe she died assisting someone else. It's easy to romanticize ancient midwives, to imagine them as kindly, mystical figures, whispering prayers and delivering life with confidence. But more often, they were tired, overworked, underfed, surrounded by death as much as by life. If she died while helping someone else, there would have been panic. The community may have tried to move her quickly, not into a proper tomb, but into the edges, away from the ritual purity of the workers' own burial spaces. A practical decision. It's not cruel, just survival. The linen cloth placed beside her, that was the compromise. The apology, and what of the others who knew her? Maybe there was a girl who once carried water for her, a neighbor who borrowed oil, a mother who had 3 children safely because of her. They would have known her name, and would have whispered at once, but they had no authority to record it. No stone carver to hire, no scribe to inscribe. So the name faded, and the cloth remained. That's the paradox of ancient Egypt. So much attention to the afterlife, to memory, to immortality, and yet so many lives left unremembered. The pyramid texts soared in poetic grandeur. The tomb paintings showed banquets, offerings, harmony. But for women like her, death came quietly, without witnesses. Still, modern archaeology is learning to listen differently. Soil analysis, textile patterns, tooth wear all reveal stories without writing. And slowly, painfully, the unnamed are gaining voices. We begin to ask different questions. What does it mean to serve a society so fully and still be forgotten? What does it mean to exist only in the margins of records and the folds of cloth? Today, in museums, you'll find statues of queens and goddesses, elegant and powerful. But what if there were a place for her, too? It's not a statue, perhaps, but a plaque. It's a space where a visitor might pause and read. Here lies a woman who helped others be born. Her name was never written, but her cloth remembers. There's no glamour in this story, no treasure, no curses or grand temples, just the ache of hands that worked too long, the silence of a grave too shallow, and the memory of a cloth that meant everything in a world that didn't think it meant much at all. And that's the disturbing truth. So many women who made survival possible were buried without ceremony, without voice, without name, but not forgotten, not anymore. You've heard her story, now quietly, softly, at the edge of sleep. So the next time someone speaks of ancient greatness of kings and battles, of temples and gods, remember the woman with the cloth. She was part of it. 2. Good night. Dot. 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 Add it and done on. I you and they and I you guys I